Illustration is basically a very directed form of botanical art, and it's one that usually the artist is asked to do a drawing of a very specific plant or group of plants and represents them in a way to please a specific audience. And that to me is what kind of defines illustration. Botanical art is just, you can make a pretty picture of any flower, and it doesn't have to be exactly accurate, but it can be beautiful. So I'm going to start from the beginning, where I think illustration, as far as, well, I should say like European illustration started, is way back in the 1500s with herbals. Now, there were things going on way before then. Yes, the Romans had illustration and everyone else. But what happened in the 1500s was that the people asking for illustrations were herbalists. They were into medicine. They wanted accurate drawings of plants. They didn't want just a sketch. They didn't want some stylized design. They wanted accurate pictures so that the people that read the herbals could see the plant and identify it. And that is why certain things define like the beginning of illustration as we think of it today, very accurately done from specimens. This one is, again, it's from the 16th century, well, 1543. Leonard Fuchs was, he was basically an herbalist, we call him. And he wrote this book, the New Kräuterbuch, which was like the herbal book. And he had artists hired to draw plants from living specimens. So they could be accurately drawn and pictured, and these would be printed as woodcuts. And as woodcuts, you can print numbers of them. So again, the idea is to pass on the information. And these woodcuts, they were beautiful. They were then hand colored because everything had to be done by hand. They didn't actually have lithography as we know it now. And so they were doing engravings on a copper plate. And then as they printed, someone would color in the copper plate with the appropriate colors. So he had, one of the artists was Albert Meyer, who did a lot of the drawings. Then there was a process. Then they were transferred to wood blocks. So these were then actually cut into wood. And then another person engraved them. And that was, the engraver was in Strasbourg. So they went through a process to make these into a book. And then they were bound. And then they were, of course, sold. So that was kind of the beginning. Now we're going to skip into another century to someone that you might be more familiar with, is Maria Sibylla Merian. Now her paintings either were actually done for, they were done for the beauty of the flower. But Maria Sibylla Merian, from the time she was young, she did her first drawing, her first insect and plant drawing at the age of 13 that was recognizable as a very specific insect and plant. And she did this because her mother had married a painter, a painter who was painted still lifes. So she went into painting at a very early age, but she was also interested in nature. So she would go out and look at plants and say, oh, there's insects on them. She just had this interest in it. So she had that ability to paint and also to look at nature and to look at it accurately and to portray it. So even though she made her living for a number of years just painting flowers, she got into the interest of looking at the bugs that were on the flowers or the butterflies and seeing a connection. And she was married in 75, and then she was divorced some years later. She had 2 daughters, and she went into this Labadist community, which was in Friesland. It was sort of the Netherlands. And she became, in that community, she was kind of isolated, but she really started to look at this relationship with the plants and the insects. And she got divorced from her husband. I think they, whatever it was, she kind of went off into this community to be separated. And so she became interested in where these, where were these butterflies from? These were, they had flowers in the garden, but they were imported from one of the Dutch colonies, Suriname. So she petitioned to go to Suriname and was received a grant. And that was in 1679. She she wrote her first book in 1679. And then she finally went to, I think it was 1699. She left for Suriname with her 2 daughters and was there until 1701. In that time frame, she did hundreds of these intricate paintings of plants and their insect associations, and also some animals too. She came back in 1701. Actually, she was ill. They think it was malaria. And in 1705, she produced, with the help of the Dutch royalty, she was able to produce these full color, hand-colored engravings of the Metamorphosis Insectorum Surinamensurium. And that was her work that is now known all over. It's she lived another she lived till 1717. So her work did get around, and still today we look at it as incredibly accurate depictions of this plant and insect interaction. And now we're going to skip right into chromolithography. This is when the art of passing on the illustrations to a wider audience became known. Chromolithography is, of course, printing on stone with several colors. This way, you don't sit and hand color each plate. So it really was something that speeded up the process of passing on information about plants. And a number of these were started under Curtis, William Curtis. He was a botanist, he was an apothecary, he was at Kew Gardens. He started this magazine, Curtis's Magazine, which now is called Kew Magazine, is still today. Of course, it's not done with chromolithography or hand-painted engravings, but it started in 1787 and is actually continued today. And this was sort of the golden age of botanical art because there was an interest in growing plants and in looking at them to grow. And so you needed accuracy. And again, now we're into the late 1700s, into the 1800s. And we have people that are publishing beautiful pictures of plants. This was Temple of Flora. And this, of course, is published by a whole number of different publishers now. But this was started by a Robert John Thornton, and he hired illustrators to do this for him. He was a publisher, so he had an idea that he wanted to publish beautiful pictures, accurate pictures of plants and flowers, and put them in incredible backgrounds. Some of them related to the plant, others were kind of mystical and incredible, but they were done with so many different techniques. He used intaglio, aqua tint. He actually had them hand color them. And it became a process that never could make money. He tried to borrow money from different sources. He even appealed to the Queen. He said, "Can I borrow some money? I will make these beautiful paintings and intaglios for you." And he basically died a pauper because he could not get the money to print the volume that he wanted. We had 33 plates that were done. He wanted to do hundreds. But of course, today you see them all over the place, and they're beautiful because they're accurate, even though they have a very kind of imagined background. but still they require good foresight into drawing. Now we're into kind of the magazines of the 1880s. John Jules Linden was a publisher of these orchid books. So he had a number of people doing orchids in this chromolithography. And he had subscriptions. So now it was paying off. Once you had a subscription, you had people that, of course, wanted to buy your subscriptions monthly. And so this continued for a number of years with these beautiful orchid lithographs done in that chromolithography. Now we get into the US exploring expeditions. This is a whole different group of drawings that were begun because they were an exploration of unknown territory. And of course, some of these early ones, we know that there is the Wilkes expedition, which marks the earliest one that was basically supported by the US government. These are some samples of our plants in our herbarium. These are done, these were then drawn by the artists on the expedition. It was Alfred Agate, James Drayton, Schaefer. There were some other people that were on this voyage. They were naturalists. And I put in a picture just to show you what collecting at that time was like. On the left is a stack of pressed plants in presses. It's just, of course, we get these every day, but that was just such an amusing picture. I put it in. So, like I said, see, these are some of the collections that are actually in our herbarium, which I could go and I actually pulled these out and took pictures of them. And here's some examples of some of the artwork from the Wilkes expedition. The Wilkes expedition started in 1838, but it didn't end until 1842. There was something like seven schooners along on this voyage. Of course, Wilkes was the captain, but there are a number of other captains on each ship. Apparently, what I read about him, he wasn't a very nice captain. He apparently flogged his subordinates, so it's kind of makes me think of Cook. But anyway, and Captain Bligh, and they were kind of along that ruthless same nature. But he had these illustrators drawing while they were on these voyages. And so some of this was also in our herbarium. These are old lithos, which is why they're a little bit discolored. They are foxing. A few were hand colored. Many are just simple black and white lithographs. And these today form the basis of so much of our collection. He collected some 60,000 specimens, which we have many, and thousands actually were deposited with the U.S. Botanic Garden. I think they do have a few Wilkes. They said they have a few of the Wilkes expedition plants in their collection. I think that are still alive. They're from the seedlings of them. They're very proud of that. And now we get into collections that were done on land. And this is a group of illustrations that were found by, get this, an intern, a summer intern came, this was about 6 years ago. She was working on Cactaceae, doing a survey of just cactus plants. When she was doing this survey in her herbarium, she finds a drawing. It's the drawing on the far left. It's Echinocactus whipplei. And she brings it to me and she said, you're the artist in here, so are you interested in this drawing? I just found it in the herbarium. And I looked at it and I said, yes, that drawing is done by an illustrator, by a botanical illustrator, because of the accuracy of the line work. And I said, where did you get it? She showed me, and I started pulling out more and more. There's 2 more drawings here. They were all made into lithographs, which appeared in a book, which was a survey. It was a survey of a railroad route from the Mississippi River to the Pacific. It took place beginning in actually 1853. It started, but it says 1854 is the volume. So the drawings were made sometime between 1853 and 1856 were the last drawings. And they were deposited in with the plants. They were not even pulled out as a separate illustration. So we are finding these historic illustrations still in our herbarium. So this is an indication that things are never really lost forever. They're just lost for a while, maybe 100 or 200 years. So here we have some more recent drawings. These were done in the late 1800s, 1896 to about 1904. These were done by actually an artist who preceded me with a title as the staff illustrator for the U.S. National Herbarium, not the Department of Botany, which we became later after 1940. But these were drawings that were done by this artist, Frederick Andrews Walpole. And I started looking up his life. He was hired by one of our botanists, Frederick Koval, because it was discovered drawing in the field where Frederick Koval was collecting plants on an expedition. And this was in Oregon. So it was still a lot of things are still being discovered in Western US. And apparently Koval said, I love your sketches. Do you think, can you do plants? And he was like, yes, I can do plants. So he hired him. That's how easy it was to be hired in the government back then. So Frederick Walpole came to be hired on staff in apparently 1894 and worked until 1904. Unfortunately, he apparently died of yellow fever while on a collecting trip. Very sad, but he made a whole number of beautiful illustrations in graphite, pen and ink, brush and ink, and in watercolor. And many of these are actually deposited at the Botanical Institute at the Hunt Library, which is associated with Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. And I've been there, and apparently they do have a lot of our collections. And then I traced back, why do you have our collections of historic plants? I mean, why aren't they here? And I started looking, and they said, well, we had a curator who apparently worked in your department and borrowed them on loan and brought them to the Hunt Institute, where he was hired to be their curator of art. So he brought with them some 4,200 illustrations from our collection. The fortunate thing is he called it a collection on indefinite loan. And the way I figure it, he actually saved our collection. They were stored in the basement of our building at Natural History, which floods from time to time. And I think he realized it. And at that time, I wasn't hired. And so he decided on his own to take care of a botanical art collection and take it with him to his new job. So these are all at the, basically, except for, I think we have about 15 of these. He has the other 150 or 200 at the Hunt. And also another collection that was discovered in our herbarium. Mary Emily Eaton, who was actually a British illustrator, who came to the US originally to work at New York Botanical Garden, where she formed a kind of an alliance with Nathaniel Lord Britton. And then he worked with one of our curators, Joseph Nelson Rose, and the two of them were writing a book on cactaceae. So seeing her beautiful artwork, and she also worked for National Geographic, I found out. They hired her to do the paintings for this 4-volume cactus work. And amazingly enough, these paintings of cactus are actually in our collection. And apparently they were found in some old wooden cabinets outside our library on the 4th floor. And when I was just starting to do my database back in 1990, somebody pointed out to me, hey, there's a bunch of cactus paintings downstairs. And I went and looked at them. I said, wow, these are gorgeous. And it turns out they were the Mary Emily Eaton from that time. Now, these are not in our collection, but I thought I'd put them in as examples of illustrations done for the US, but for the Department of Agriculture, basically. They're in the National Agricultural Library. And this was an amazing work because these are all online. You can just look up the NAL collection online, and I think it's called the Pomological Collection. It's fruits, vegetables, nuts, and they're all depicted basically like this. One single specimen on each page, and they're life-sized. So they're various sizes. So they're beautifully painted and they're very accurate. And they have apparently 1,200 apple varieties. I don't think we have that many extant apple varieties right now. But that's how they actually painted every apple variety ever known, at least in the US. Now we're into the 1900s. And this is Agnes Chase. Again, she was not hired as an illustrator, but she was a botanist. But she did her own drawings. And her collections are also at the Hunt. And they're beautiful grass drawings. These are published in the Manual of the Grasses of the United States. They're exquisite. They're line drawings. This one's enlarged a lot, the one on the left, which is one of the seeds, one of the spiny seeds. And so they're just very exquisite line illustrations made for a manual. Now we're finally into my era. Okay, these are two people that I knew. Down below me are the two botanists that I worked for when I first came here, Cleo Calderon and Tom Soderstrom. They worked on bamboo, and they actually started before I started working here, but they hired two illustrators to do their bamboo drawings. On the left is Florence Lambeth's drawing, and on the right is one by Jacina B. Threlkeld. They were contractors. So these people were not officially on staff. But again, they made some drawings for these two curators and were paid on grants. And at the same time that they were doing those, another illustrator was hired to do lichens. This is Jack Schroeder. And he worked on something called the Picture Key series on how to know the lichens. Now, they had a second volume. I had some in the second volume. But he did these with a technique which I took up after him. It's drawing with, we call them polycarbonate pencils. I'll show you some later. And it's drawing on film. So these drawings, even they're on white backing paper, but the drawings themselves are on translucent film. And that's basically how I draw. And so I had to follow in his footsteps. And these date from, I'd say, the late 60s through the early 70s. And this is where I start. Okay, I'm here on the side with these I'm the very young illustrator on the side there. I don't know if you can you see me on the side, or am I hidden? I'm not sure if I'm hidden or not. Anyway, hopefully you can see this young illustrator on the side. And that's how I began. I just came in and started working for this botanist, Lyman Smith. He was a Harvard botanist. He'd been working here since the 1960s. He came from Harvard, worked at the Gray Herbarium. He did his own drawings, but one summer he needed an extra illustrator. He happened to live in Kensington, Maryland, where I grew up. A neighbor that knew I liked to draw said, you know what, there's a botanist in the neighborhood. He's looking for a summer artist. Maybe you could draw for him. You know, you're just going to junior college. I think I started then. But you have your summers off, so you could go downtown and draw for this botanist. So I went over to his house and I took a portfolio. I didn't have any plants, but I had horse and dog drawings. So I took them to him and he looks at them and he's very Harvard. He says, do you have any plants? And I said, oh, and I kind of pointed to the grass under the horse's hooves. And he kind of looked at me and he said, well, why don't you come on down to the museum and I'll give you a try. And that was the start of my career. That was in 1968. And on the far left, you see one of my first drawings. That was on Bristol board, and it's a bromeliad. And I included some samples of some media I used. I used this Chronoflex film, which was a translucent film. And I used this Bristol board called Strathmore Patent Office Board. So here's where I work. Now to contemporary. We'll just go through them all real quickly. This is the mall side, of course, natural history. Now we're going in behind the scenes. Here's our herbarium. This is kind of an artificially pictured scene of the herbarium. You would never see this array on any counter. You would most likely see one or two botanists, and they'd have the same series of plants. This is to show the variety that we have in our herbarium. We have everything from the double coconut to a 6-foot long bean, which floats around the world. And we have samples of bamboo culms from Southeast Asia. We have things from all over. And here's my office. I still have the same table. Actually, if you look around my room, you can kind of see I have the same old stuff. We do have a new flatbed scanner. That's my volunteer doing some scanning. And next to me, I have a nice Wacom Cintiq. Actually, I have an even a newer one than that. And here I am at a microscope, which recently got replaced with a brand new Leica with a camera. So now I'm switching to digital. And here's the rest of my room, which kind of looks like the background. Right now, these are the botanists I work for. I have, there's right now 7 staff botanists, and we have a number of, I call them emeritus, so they come in from time to time. So the 7 staff are up here. I do Poaceae, Malvaceae, Sapindaceae, and here I work for Warren. He does a little of everything in Southeast Pacific. And Ken works on euphorbs and Rutaceae and some other weird groups. And here's our fern guy. And June Wen, I've done Vitaceae, Prunaceae, let's see, Ginseng's Aureliaceae. So we have a variety of people. Now, how do plants come to our museum? This is where I want to say, this is sort of the start of how do things start here? This is how things come to the museum. 5 million plants in our museum. How do they get here? They don't appear magically like this. This is how they come to our department, although they unmounted usually. But they come from the field. And this is how they start. So we have collectors that go out in places where the average person maybe wouldn't be out in the field. These are in Guyana, which I have been to, and I can tell you it's kind of difficult to get to some of these places. They go by canoe, they might go by jeep, they might go by, well, they might be flown in. So this is one of the places. They're usually collecting on foot. Here's Karen Redden on the far left. She's pointing at some plant. She's probably saying, hey, can somebody reach that for me? And then we have tree climbers. And then we have people by the river, and they're probably looking for plants that are aquatic. And the collecting opportunities go everywhere from Guyana, Madagascar, all over South America, Africa, Asia, everywhere. We've been on all the continents, even Antarctica. We have lichens from Antarctica. So anyway, here we have Karen. She's looking at some of her Paloes, which I've drawn. There I am in the field on the far left. I'm sketching a heliconia. In the center is one of the I think she's the wife of one of our scientists. She's collecting, and here's one of the nice hotels in Guyana, apparently. Oh no, that's in Madagascar. And the interesting thing is, I think there's a sign that says, it has the name of the hotel, but there's some sign that says, please do not vomit here. And I thought, okay, if that sums up that class of hotel. And here's the thrill of collecting. We have our 5-course meal there on the upper left, which is usually 4 cans and something that somebody probably made with some flour and water. And here's Ken. He's one of the botanists I worked for that's pressing in the field. I mean, he's sitting on a bucket because sometimes you don't have a nice chair with you. And he's pressing plants that he's collected. And here we have one of the botanists, Larry Dorr. He brought his 13-year-old son to collect with him in Venezuela. He brought him during the rainy season, which was probably a mistake if you're trying to get your son interested in being a botanist. From the look on the face of his son, I don't think he wanted to necessarily return. Apparently it was heavily raining all the time, so they were basically wet. But here's the same botanist, and here's the 13-year-old daughter of his companion botanist pressing. I don't know if she's become a botanist or not. And this is how we get the plants after they're pressed, and they're stored in these, it could be cardboard boxes. These just happen to be plastic. They're either put on mules to a truck to an airplane. And that's what they're loading onto that airplane. One of the things that I remembered was they had to weigh you before you got on a plane when you're flying on small planes. Then the specimens arrive here in boxes, and then they're mounted on sheets. We have a crew of collectors that mount. They go into a freezer. I think they go into a freezer before they're actually mounted. It's to kill the bug, so it's a 2-week process. Then they're mounted on plants, and this is how I get them. So this is how I see the plants. So the first thing I do, I make a photocopy. And then I start by making a rough sketch from this photocopy. And then I say, okay, what do you want me to draw on this plate with the plant drawing? Oh, these tiny little fruits. We want you to draw the fruits, the flowers. And this is where I put them under the microscope. I make these little sketches. They're enlarged. And this has a camera lucida, which kind of projects kind of your hand on the paper. Anyway, it's been now superseded by a digital camera. And whenever I have digital images, I make use of them. I look at them. Oh, look, that leaf looks like that when it's live, or like that. And these are the fruits. And look at those flowers. They're not pressed and dried. So I make use of those images to reconstruct them. Then I make a finished drawing, and it's again to a certain size for a book. This one happens to be a flora of the Guyanas, and they're dealing with certain plants. So this was then inked on this Denril. Denril is a film that I can now say used to be made because I found out they discontinued it during COVID. A film that I've drawn on for 25 years was discontinued. Nobody told me. I bought the last few pads by calling around, and now they're gone. So now I have to learn to draw on a different surface. But this drawing was done on Denril with all of these pens, some little, two little nib pens, a brush, and this is a rapidograph for stippling. So you can see the line work has to be very accurate, and there is kind of a convention. You have to show a leaf front and back, and it has to show the outline. So they aren't foreshortened. So that's how you know it's not just made for a calendar. It's made for a botanist. And these are some of the quills. A lot of these quills, like the film I just showed you, are discontinued. These are still made. Some of the gelates you can buy from England. I don't think this is made anymore. It was a gold-plated one I found. These might actually still be made, the gelate crow quill. This has been discontinued, this gelate tit quill. And if you notice the names, many of the names are based on the bird's feathers. There's actually an eagle quill, there's a hawk, there's crow, there's a tit quill. I don't know if there's a rooster quill, there could be. Anyway, it's a little variety. After I finish the drawing, I scan it, and there it is. I blow it up on my digital screen, and I add stippling. And that way, see the stippling on there? That's all done on the screen. These little tiny hairs are done on this screen. The nice thing about digital images is you can draw in Photoshop on these layers that can then be kept, or if the botanist doesn't like it, which you always have to listen to the botanist, they can be removed with a click of a button instead of erasing all the lines on a drawing. So this is how I sometimes start drawing. I start backwards. I start with a digital image and work to a physical image. So I started this one with the plant, and I was told they just want the plant. They don't want the background. They don't want these other leaves. We just want this rosette. And I can draw the rosette. This happened to be collected in South Africa. Let's see, it was for a former curator who sadly passed away in 2018. And she'd just been on a collecting trip. So fortunately, she saw these in publication because these came out earlier. But then I drew this on the screen digitally, made a print of it, took the print, put the film, the tracing film on top of the print, the digital print, and using my polycarbonate, my plastic pencils, I made this graphite sketch, which I can tell you because of the effort of making this, it didn't take really any more effort to draw it this way than if I'd drawn it on here, because every little area had to be shaded. It couldn't be replicated. In the computer, if you have to replicate areas, you can save time. But in this case, I couldn't. And the reason I chose these particular pencils and the film, because you can trace on the film, and they make nice, rich blacks, everything from black to very, very light gray. And here's a view of the pencils. And now you're asking, are these pencils around? No, they've been discontinued. They were discontinued because they were never made for scientific illustrators. We're too small an audience to manufacture anything for. So when these were made, they were still being used by architects and engineering draftspeople that drew. cars, all kinds of appliances. Then that all went to CAD, to computer, automated drafting. So that was back in the late 80s, early 90s. Totally stopped. I have a selection of these, which I covet. I buy them on sometimes eBay, or I ask people if they know architects who have collections. So now we have a second view of that. It's the same plant, but we're doing it entirely from a specimen. Not a digital one, but a dried one, because we want a particular view. The botanist said, I want this view, but combine it with this view from this specimen. So by combining the two dried specimens, I'm able to get a nice drawing of everything. And these are all drawn under the microscope. They're much enlarged. And this again is on the film, and it's using those polycarbonate discontinued pencils. But again, I guess I will just have to expand my digital aspect as these things disappear. Here's an example of something. I draw everything. I draw everything from a microscopic plant to something that's a palm tree. So here's a sedge. This is one of the smallest plants I've drawn. This is the entire plant. That's an angiosperm. And this little tiny sedge is the size of a dime. So I had to enlarge the plant itself just to draw it. And then these are all drawn at times 50, 60, 75. They're all parts. It's the spikelet, the glooms, the little achene, which is the fruit, and then the whole plant. And the story behind this is Paul Peterson, my scientist, was camping in Mexico, and he was sleeping in a sleeping bag. And when he woke up in the morning, he rolled out of a sleeping bag, and he looked at this tiny sedge and identified it as a new species. Only a botanist could do that. And here's one of the larger things I've drawn, where I was asked to start with the specimens from dried plants, not a photo. So this is a fern frond, and it was pressed. Here's 5. I think it was pressed on 7 different sheets or something, but here's 5 sheets that I used. Now, when you're pressing something that's, it was 7 feet long, you press parts of it, and you put the parts on different sheets. And then you sort of label them, sheet 1, 2, whatever. So here's your root base, your rhizome. And I started putting it together with this. Now they folded up the stipe several times back and forth, so I had to kind of manufacture it. And what I did was I photocopied it, and I made photocopies and I had to replicate them for the other side, change them a little bit because they're not perfectly, not perfectly opposite. So I made this fern frond from these by photocopy. And then I asked the photo lab to shoot a picture of it and reduce it down from its 7-foot size to 2 feet. And then I finished the drawing as a 2-foot drawing. So this is a sample of a drawing that started as a black and white drawing. It's a Enothera macrocarpa. I made it originally. They said, can you make it for a t-shirt? But it's one of the plants that we're, working on for this group. So it's in the Anna Gracie. So I drew this kind of the size I draw the regular plant, but they said it's t-shirt. Can you put a background? Okay, what is the background? Well, here's some pictures of the background where it would grow. It's a meadow, and then there's trees. Fine. Then they said, oh, can you add some color? We kind of want some color added. Okay, I'll add some color in the foreground, and I'll start adding it. Do you want color in the background? So I got this far. They said, yes, color the whole thing. All right, here's the final. It's completely colored in, and it's done in a full color process. But when they started, they weren't unsure of how much money they had for printing. So again, you're kind of limited by what the economics of the whole process are. And that seems to be the story of illustrations. How much is it going to cost? So we do have other things that I've done in black and white that then had color added. This was a new species of Innozingia borealis. It's a globa, and it was found growing actually in the markets in it was in Asia. I think it was in Asia. So it was discovered being sold in the markets, and they said, oh, it's a new species. It used to be called the weeping goldsmith because it was such a beautiful plant. They said even a goldsmith couldn't make a plant that beautiful. It was a new species, so it was just globa spa when I was drawing it. So when I finished the drawing in pen and ink and they were going to publish it, they came to me on, get this, a Thursday afternoon. Somebody said, hey, can you make that pen and ink drawing? Can you make it in watercolor? And can you make it so it can be framed and ready by Tuesday? And I'm looking at them like, huh? Like, it's Thursday afternoon. There's Friday. And you want it framed and kind of ready to hang? Oh yeah, because we have a ceremony on Tuesday. We're presenting the framed, finished picture to the person we're naming it after, who is Shirley Sherwood. And I'm like, that's nice. But it's Thursday. It's Thursday afternoon. I have a black and white drawing. And they said, well, we'll bring the live plant to you tomorrow, so you can start Friday. So here I am. I'm starting Friday on this plant. And I said, it has to be colorized too. So I said, I have all of this drawn, outlined very carefully in pen and ink. Why don't I start with that, scan it in, and colorize it like they do with the movies? So this is totally digital color. And the species was named Globa sherwoodiana after Shirley Sherwood because she donated the money that paid for the trip to collect the plant. So the whole thing kind of has a story involved. So I worked on it all weekend, colorized it. By Monday morning, I had the complete digital in color, send it to the photo lab, who had to make an archival full-size print. It was full size for the plant, so it's about 21 inches by 14 or so, 15. And then it was sent to a framer that evening. And apparently it was finished by Tuesday and presented to her. So that's a story that tells me that, sometimes you have to switch to digital to get something done. And here's something that started in the flower mart. Maybe that was the one that started this whole issue of botanical illustration. I know that I started this way back. Maybe it was before then, because I think I was drawing another plant, I think, when Dan came by. Anyway, this was one that I did at the flower mart, and I did it in black and white on this, same paper, the film, with a polycarbonate pencil. And then I was told, hey, we're going to have a show, but everything's in color. Can you make that in color? I said, okay, well, I'm not going to paint on top of it. And they said, no, you can't use digital. It has to all be by hand. So all that color is underlying this graphite. And it was, because it was translucent film, you could see the color underneath. So it was a layer, we call it layered graphite watercolor. Painting, drawing, whatever, mixed media. And it was in the show and it sold. And then I used the same kind of idea for a coloring book, which came out later. And so I used the same technique when I drew some of these peonies, oh, camellias, not peonies, camellias at Huntington. It's this Camellias Asanqua. They asked me to do something from their gardens and do it in a class. So I had to do something kind of quick that was in color. And I used that same technique, graphite with underlying watercolor. And I used a little color pencil on top to really bring out the two-tone effect. And that's what I did. It's the same graphite with watercolor. And I wanted to finish with, this is my way of showing a botanist with his plant. This is Dan Nicholson, oh, dear departed Dan. He loved this picture. This was in 2003. That Amorphophallus, which was the group that he studied, bloomed in our U.S. Botanic Garden. We all went over to see it from Natural History. And I took a picture of Dan just standing there. And he was wearing a t-shirt that I designed after this plant. And somebody said, well, we want to give it as a kind of a birthday surprise for Dan. Can you make a digital and somehow have him associated with that plant? That's totally digital, a digital picture of Amorphophallus with Dan Nicholson perched inside his own plant. So as I say, that's how I like to see my scientists, captured by their own plants. So thank you very much. And I'll sign off my share screen, or let's see, shall I get back into sharing?
I think that was wonderful. I really appreciate this talk, Alice. We had a couple of comments. Carol Allen has some of the pencils that you like. Maybe she should ship them to you. I don't know. Are there any other questions or comments?
Okay, let's
just say it.
Dan, go ahead and go ahead and speak or unmute yourself so y'all can ask questions.
This is Dan Weil speaking. I think I have several of those pencils somewhere in the house, and I'd be delighted to get them to Alice.
Oh my gosh, you have some of the pencils.
I think I do. I used them for years.
Oh, you know what? They're not made anymore. They're vintage.
That is heartbreaking.
They're vintage pencils.
I hope I still have them, and I'll get them to you, Alice.
Dan, I know I do, because when I taught design, I made my students make their first design in pencil and then ink by hand. And I had department heads just shaking their fist at me saying, you do it computer. I said, no, you learn how to do it by hand first. So Alice, I may have a bunch of those pencils. I should check and see.
Oh, that's great.
Carol and I can probably both give you some.
Yeah.
Oh, this is amazing.
Alice, this is fabulous. Absolutely.
I am just, well, I'm thrilled because when I gave a sort of a similar talk in Nantucket, I aimed it more at the Nantucket people. And I did mention the pencils, and somebody in the audience came up right after and she said, I'm going to bring all of my architecture pencils to you tomorrow. Because where I was staying at a friend's house, and she rode over on a bike and gave me some pencils. Now, not all of them, they weren't all polycarbonate. Some of them were simply, they were Mars pencils, but they were not the ones for they were made as graphite pencils. In other words, they were made for drawing on pencil or paper. The polycarbonate ones are actually kind of rare because they were only made for drafting film. They don't really work very well on paper.
Well, for several years, we did all our work on drafting film.
Oh my gosh, yes, because that's what people used. And what's happening now is I found that my favorite film was discontinued in 2021. Mm-hmm. And I went to Borden and Riley. I went to the actual Manufacturer sent them a message and they said, discontinued 2021, we're not making it anymore. There you go. It's an artifact of what is changing in everything, books, illustration. It's going to this digital world, which is sometimes it's a little scary for me. I say, well, I like to have a physical drawing. I like to know that I have the physical, like the pencil and the pen and the watercolor on a piece of paper or film, and it's physically there. If it's in the computer, it's simply a series of electronic bits and pieces, and the output is a print. So I tell people, so what is your original when you're talking a digital? And they're always like, well, it's your print. And I said, but you can make 100 prints. And are they all originals? I mean, what is the actual answer for an original in your digital media? Because I get all kinds of answers for that. But anyway, it's one of those issues. So, well, hopefully we'll have their flower mart in person. Yes.
Question. Hi, my name is Fran Dion, and thank you so much. This was a wonderful, wonderful chat on your part. I was wondering if you ever collaborate with people from other countries, illustrators from other countries, or perhaps you have botanists from foreign countries who send in their specimens to be added to the collections. And of course, they need to be illustrated. How does that work? And is there any kind of international interaction?
Oh, actually, there is. Well, it's right now. It's highly regulated. It's changed over the years. We would get foreign plants all the time. We would have botanists that would have their cohorts. Their co-botanists would be in another country collecting, and they would send what they would call them as duplicates. So when you collect, you make a specimen, and if that specimen has like several with it, by growing with it, you collect the whole specimen and you either take parts of it and you say, these are duplicates. And you can send the duplicate to your fellow botanists in other countries. And it's kind of an exchange program. That fellow botanist would collect from their country and exchange it with you. So these are called duplicate collections. And that is exactly how the whole field of botany works, because obviously we can't go everywhere all at once. We rely on those botanists that we work with in other countries. And these collections are shared. And they are also on loan. Sometimes I get specimens on loan from other countries, and they have a little stamp on them. I can tell where they're from, or they have the herbarium. And those of course, I have to be very careful with them. You can't mess them up in any way. Somebody says you just draw the plant as is and you can reconstruct it, but you can't dissect it. So those are very particular when you get a loan like that, which is why I make copies, because I want to have a full-sized image of that specimen. But now, of course, we take digital pictures, and a lot of them are digital. But digital is always dependent on resolution. How high a resolution are you taking? Do you have the best camera for that? Yeah, sometimes they do, sometimes not. Sometimes the cameras, you blow up the image on the computer and it's a little fuzzy. So this is one of the issues. But again, botany is kind of a worldwide sharing of plants and information and shared collections. So it's true. And they're very strict when we go and collect, when we send people like to Brazil, the permits are immense. In fact, some people say, do you really want to go through that permit process? Let's just see if somebody there can collect something for us, because the permit process is so strict now to get a collecting permit. You can't just go there and collect. So does that explain some of the process a little bit?
Great,
I mean,
thank you.
Some of
That's
it.
great. Yeah, I hadn't thought about the permitting process. I guess, probably a lot of the same hoops when you have companies who specialize in making spices and go off and send their people in to, reap the spices from other lands, right? So anyway, but I hadn't thought about the permitting process.
Yeah, it's quite extensive.
Mm.
Yeah. So does anybody have a question, techniques or whatever? Everybody's just, what? That was such a fast array of millennia. We just kind of went through the centuries to get to today's methods.
Alice, it was amazing. I loved hearing the history of the way drawings have been done over time. I used to work for years at the University of Maryland in College Park, and I know that they no longer have a true botany department, but they did have a large botany drawing collection at one point. Have you been in touch with them? Have you been able to access that?
Actually, no, the last contact, well, I had a contact there. Let's see. Well, I drew something for Rose Broom, actually worked there years. I don't even know if she's around. Because I think she retired many years ago. I did a drawing for her. She worked at University of Maryland. And I think Jim Reveal was there, but I have lost, because I don't think we do too much interaction with the university there. We have some interaction with George Mason. And I only hear about these interactions if somebody brings me a drawing, I mean, a plant and says, I want you to draw this. And it's from their collection.
Yeah.
Because myself, I didn't even know that they had a collection of drawings.
I know the people who used to be in charge of it have long since retired, and there was really no person in charge. And I'm sure it's stuck in boxes in the back of someone's office. And I just hate for it to be lost. But yeah, it seems like it's going to be buried for a while.
Oh gosh, I know. I'd love to get a hold of the like where all. That's one of the reasons. My other job is actually caring for the collections, and I am in the process of moving to all the collections to a new room, because as we were finding everything in the herbarium, and I was adding to it my own drawings and the freelancers. I ran out of space in this little room they'd given me, and the drawings were just piling up in my office. And so they said, okay, we're giving you a bigger room, and I'm moving to a bigger room. And I'm in charge of all the botanical art in this, well, in this department, I guess in the museum, anything botanical. That's art.
So part illustrator, part librarian.
I am. It's so ironic. My mom wanted me to be a librarian. My mother loved library science, and she so hoped I would go into it. And so ironically, if only I could tell her, Mom, I am a librarian. I'm a librarian of botanical art.
Paula Simon asks, what are you working on today? What particular plant have you been working on this week?
Oh my gosh. Okay. How about this one? Oh, let's see. Oh, look at this. Is this a beauty? It's a Sertandra. It's called a Cyanioides. It's from Hawaii. It's rare. So this is one of the few collections. Dried and pressed and mounted. It's very dark brown. It grew in deep woods or rainforest. And so the leaves get very dark. Sometimes when they're pressed, I think they get kind of a mold. So that's kind of what I'm working. Isn't that exciting?
Did she go out? I think so. What? Oh, she's right there. Oh, shit.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I think I lost my microphone.
No. Hold it up again. I think people didn't get a clear view.
Oh, okay. Let me hold up this. Let's see if I can let's see if I go back. Can you?
That's good. Yeah, that's perfect.
It's big. I have to draw one leaf at a time. I can only fit 2 on a plate because of its size. And then I'm doing some digitals, which are on this other screen of the flowers. I'm doing them kind of, well, semi-digitally and semi from this plan. I'm using every method to try to get some kind of accuracy here.
And Paula is asking if you're going to colorize it when you're done.
Well, I would love to colorize it because somebody took some color photos. They're kind of old, but they're kind of fuzzy. They're not super sharp, but I could get the color from them. But this is it's a monographic flora. So it's a monograph, meaning it's kind of a survey of related plants in this genus Sertandra, which is in the family Gesneriaceae, which everybody calls African violets, although these are all over the world. These happen to be Hawaiian. And it's comparing my drawings to drawings that were done back in the early 60s. They're all going to be published together. Now, in the early 60s, remember, they're not digital and they didn't have color photos, and they're all black and white pen and ink drawings. So I am following in the same footsteps by keeping the media comparable, because when you're doing something that spans, what is that, 50? No, that's 60 years now. You have to be comparing drawings that are done 60 years apart, but kind of on the same level. So they can't be colorized now. I have to just do them as black and white pen and ink. So they can be mixed in this same flora with these drawings from the 60s. So that explains maybe why a lot of my drawings are still done in this very limited pen and ink fashion, because botanists often publish work every 30, 40, 50 years. You know, they kind of dredge up things and say, oh, I'm going to publish this, but I'm going to use something from the past, and then I'm going to use something from the present, but I want everything to look, you know, compatible. So there is a reason why I don't colorize certain things. I would love to. I think it's fun to colorize, but can't do it. So, well, that's my answer.
Are there any other questions for Alice, who's given us a wonderful education tonight?
I always see a person's face and then I go, oh, there's somebody.
Well, I'm not hearing anything else. Jim or Dan, do you have any closing words?
No, we're good.
All
I
right.
just want to thank Alice for a fabulous presentation.
Oh my gosh.
Absolutely.
This is
Thank
Oh my
you so
gosh.
much.
You are such an inspiration, Alice.
Well, well, no, I'm glad that I could pass on some information to you in a talk. I don't know. Well, this talk's gone on a little, oh my gosh, it's gone on, I guess, for over an hour now. So.
But it's wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll bid you
Thank you.
adieu. And I appreciate everybody tuning in tonight.
Okay, thank you very much.
It was just
Bye.
wonderful.
Good.